My task today before you is to introduce this report which we brought out at the end of last year, and the title is, as just said, Wake Up Before It Is Too Late, Make Agriculture, and now is the keyword, truly sustainable, now for food security in a changing climate. Let me say, look, it is not my task to go through the manuscript chapter by chapter. We have 5 of them. They are basically touching upon the main clusters of agriculture. So we have a generic chapter 1 on some of the overriding issues. We have a chapter on I would say, the climate hotspot, which is animal husbandry or livestock industry. We have a chapter on changes in land use management. We have a chapter on research and development in agriculture, and we have a chapter on trade and trade, the implications of trade rules on agriculture production and structures. What I like doing is rather to give you a snapshot of the synthesis in the report, so the main conclusions and recommendations, and the report at the end. You will see a slide with the hyperlink to download it, and on the reverse side of the cover there are the key messages summarized. So let me start with the first slide, which is on contextualization and introduction. One can go so far to say it is almost some of the key conclusions put as the foreword. So we have food security as a first conclusion. Food security, access to land and water may well become the key issues dominating the global political, economic and security agenda of the present century, not the access to fuel and not the access to strategic metals. So in our view, and that's the view of no less than about 65 internationally renowned authors coming from places like the University of Berkeley on the one hand, going all the way down to the University of New Zealand at the other end of the globe, that was the consensus drawn. So agriculture is an issue which is very important, not only for the sector development, but in fact for the international security agenda. Second, how we define efficiency, productivity, and technology decisively determines our objectivity of the discussion on what we understand by modern agriculture. Paradoxically, many consider those production systems as modern, efficient, and productive that are amongst the most polluting, squandering of natural resources, and that use much external energy. So, when we talk about what is truly sustainable, we also have to modify our definition of what is modern agriculture. The current agricultural production system, that's the third point, breeds hunger and cannot resolve it. Because the hunger problem is not related to insufficient supply, but to poverty, as Mr. Mubanga correctly said in the previous presentation. And finally, unlike most other sectors, agriculture already disposes of the production methods and also the means to be truly sustainable and well adapted to climate change. That's a big difference, because in most other sectors you don't have sufficient technological advances. To give you a precise idea of what we are talking about here, to achieve a global warming limit of 2 degrees, we would have to have a decarbonization rate, which is the rate of emissions per unit of gross domestic product. We would have to achieve at least a level, anything between 6 to 7% per annum. 6 to 7% per annum. what we have actually achieved in the last 2 decades is 0.7%. 0.7, which takes us to anything beyond 6 degrees global warming in the next 50 years. And that is not a bad joke. That is reality. 6 degrees is exactly the difference between a cold period in the history of this globe and a hot period. So 6 degrees, that is the painting on the wall. I don't want to scare you, but these are, in fact, the scientifically available figures. So the first conclusion we have drawn in our report, or the authors of our report, is there is enough food for all, but the structures are wrong. So when with 1.5%, the growth of per capita food production today is higher than in the last 50 years. So we have theoretically 4,600 kilocalories per capita available statistically, which is twice as high as what is required. So in other words, we can already today feed a population of anything between 12 and 14 billion people. We are 7.2 at the moment. So there is not insufficient supply. It is therefore debatable whether we really need to increase global food production by 50 or 70%, which unfortunately is also advocated by my colleagues, the charming colleagues from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. So our 65 co-authors, including me, do not share this view. The principal structural reasons for the supply-demand gap, in our view, are fourfold. One, the concentrate feed production for industrial livestock production is completely disproportionate. So, secondly, we have the biofuel production and other industrial biomaterial uses. I'll talk about that in a minute. Third, the pre- and post-harvest losses as high as 50%. And fourthly, increasing consumption of animal protein, notably in rapidly industrializing countries. If you look at meat consumption trends in China, this is really staggering. So here is what are the structural calamities. We have globally less than half of the cereal production that goes into food. About 1/3 is destined for animal feed, some 20% for industrial use, including biofuels. So that is the dilemma, that of this total 4,600 kilocalories, only 46% goes into food. We have in the lower part, you see here a chart on the losses, pre- and post-harvest losses. As I said, close to 50% of the physical supply. However, the most challenging thing in the future is not how we feed a globally increasing population. It is how we feed a spiraling up population of animals. So we have 9 billion people by 2050, but we have 100 billion land animals, which we need to feed if you project the current trends into the future. So that's a major challenge. So in other words, that let me already draw as one inference. The current system of industrial livestock production is one of the areas where you have the biggest challenges, and in particular, which is a climate hotspot. The second conclusion drawn in our report is that, and that Musa Mubanga also said in this presentation, hunger is principally a poverty issue and primarily in rural areas. So despite increased food production, higher productivity and liberalized markets, the share of hungry people has not significantly declined, as you can see in the chart at the bottom of the slide. So the share has remained between 15 and 17, 18% in recent years. Massive hunger particularly concerns small-scale farmers and agricultural laborers. Hunger is therefore a problem of lack of rural purchasing power and the means of production. So that is important as a policy conclusion. Here, what we can see is basically that 70% of, if you include the fishermen, it's even 80%, fishermen and pastoralists. So 80% of those suffering from hunger are themselves producers in agriculture. Let me say a brief word on the calculation of the hunger figures done by my colleagues from the Food and Agriculture Organization. You know that as one of the goals of the Millennium Development Objectives, the first goal in fact was to halve the number of hungry worldwide. So what has been done was a bit to sexy up the figures. One has changed the methodology in calculating the hunger figures. And yet, even that trick has not been sufficient to achieve that target of halving the number of hungry people by half. So if you look at the right-hand side of the chart here, what you see is that the FAO has brought down, in fact, the daily calorie intake to now almost 1,300, and no longer the 2,000 to 2,200 we used in the past, arguing that people are on average no longer so physically active, which is of course a point. But in fact, if we had used or stuck to the traditional methodology of 2,020 kilocalories per day, the current hunger figures would be oscillating around 1.3 billion instead of the 842 million reported recently by the FAO. I just want to say that to be absolutely academically accurate. Because usually policymakers are not so picky about these little things. So working for, I have to say that I have been working for the UN for the last 30 years, so I still consider myself an academic trapped as a bureaucrat in the UN system, but the academic has been the overriding character. So that's why I'm a bit critical of these things. And I forgot to say, look, I have been enamored to sustainable agriculture, in particular organic agriculture, for the last 15, 20 years. And I'm myself an organic farmer, although at small scale. So I know what, for me, it's not only an academic subject. For me, that's also a very labor-intensive subject. I just want to say that, that's a footnote. The third conclusion is, as was also mentioned by Musa Mubanga, smallholders produce the bulk of food globally. So according to the UNCTAD report, roughly one can say 70% of global food supply in calorie terms comes from small-scale producers. And not from the industrial value chains, as is often believed, in particular by policymakers and by many consumers in the West. So one should not forget, Musa Mubanga mentioned in Africa the share of agriculture in GDP is about 30%. That's correct. However, when it comes to agriculture, I think expressing the importance of agriculture in GDP terms is probably not the best approach. A more useful approach would be to look at what is the total share of agricultural produce in gross production and in gross employment. And then you come to figures in most developing countries where agriculture accounts for anything between 60 and 80% of gross production, and the same of gross employment. So agriculture in any developing country, probably with the exception of places like South Korea, Singapore, or the like, agriculture is by far the most important sector. In fact, I would go so far to say it is the sector for developing countries. And yet, less than 5% of public government money goes into agriculture, which I think is not only insane, that is bordering on a criminal act. A fourth conclusion, and that now gets to the very core of the challenge, is the existing market asymmetry in global agriculture. We have a market concentration of agricultural inputs, processing and trade, which is rather exceptional by any standard in industry. So here you can see what we are talking about. Traded seeds, so the 10 largest companies account for 75% of the market, and you go through agrochemicals, 91%, fertilizers, 41%, biotechnology, 2/3, and more. And what we have is a situation in which, on the one hand, we have hundreds of millions of farmers as producers, and we have, at the other end, hundreds of millions of consumers, and they are sandwiched by a sort of a handful or 2 or 3 handful of companies. And these companies have set up that system over the last 20 to 25 years in the age of neoliberalism. So in other words, we have a system which is intentionally set up to be external input intensive and to be very energy intensive. In fact, modern agriculture is the best way of converting fuel into food. So that is not by coincidence. This is intentional because it serves the market asymmetry. The fifth conclusion is we have an aggravating environmental crisis in agriculture. So we have significant resource limits and contamination. We have the erosion of the ecological function of the soil production function, and the soil's regulatory function. We have limited water availability, water quality, and water contamination. We have nitrogen contamination of soil and water, and we have biodiversity loss beyond the point of no return. That is, the graph below is from the Stockholm Resilience Center, and you see of the 3 global limits, we have either already crossed or are close to crossing them. So that is, on the one hand, nitrogen contamination. The second one is biodiversity loss, where in both cases we are beyond the point of no return. And the third one is climate change, and climate change, let me already say at this juncture, agriculture is the single biggest source for climate change. So it's the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases globally. And therefore, it's not only significantly impacted by climate change, but it's also contributing to a large extent. So we have grave problems with animal health and welfare in industrial livestock production, and we have, as I said, considerable contribution of agriculture to global warming. Anything between 40 and 50% of global greenhouse gas emissions comes from agriculture. Here you see almost a quarter of agricultural land is already degraded. And that is a trend which continues. We have implications of, just as an example, of excessive nitrogen use. In the chart, you can see that since 1960, the volume of nitrogen fertilizers applied has increased almost by 9 times, all fertilizers by almost 6 times. However, in the same period, the global cereal production has not even doubled. So, in other words, the fertilizer intensity of production has significantly increased. Yet, one would expect that the yields would follow that trend, and yet we don't see that is happening. If you look at the function plotted in the upper right corner, that is the yields of cereal production in France between 1960 and 2010. And you can see at the bend in recent years, basically there has been a flattening of the curve. And that same image you get when you plot the yields for Germany, for example, and the UK. So it seems to be a general trend, and that is that the yield increases in recent years have in fact significantly decreased. In fact, we have only moderate yield increases despite a very high external input intensiveness. And that leads us, when you look at this figure at the bottom on the right, to a kind of trap in which farmers find themselves. Here you have plotted the costs of input against the prices realized by the products, and you can see that the costs have been outpacing the product prices. So in other words, the producers are in that sort of trap, and the only way of getting out is usually you increase the scale of production. So that has actually been followed, but it is of course not a fundamental solution to that very problem. A sixth conclusion drawn in our report is that agriculture is a major cause and victim of climate change. So agriculture accounts for only 4% of global GDP. When one includes processing and retail, it goes up to about 15%. But at the same time, when you include into the figures also the processing, the trade of food and agricultural goods, then agriculture generates anything between 40 and 45% of greenhouse gas emissions, which is in fact the single most important contribution. So higher than what comes from fuel combustion. And that principally, as you can see in the bar chart on top, comes in particular from developing countries. So in developing countries, the trend is significantly up, whereas in developed countries, it's basically a stagnation, but not a major decline as required. In the LDCs, as you can see at the bottom of the pie chart, agriculture is the single biggest source for climate change. Basically, one can say anything between 70 and 80% of greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. So for developing countries, basically when talking about mitigation of climate change, that is basically an issue of agriculture. Yet, here we have once again the dilemma between what is happening and what is required. What is happening is we have had between 1990 and 2005 an increase in agriculture, that these are non-CO2, and non-CO2 account for 95% of all agricultural emissions in the agriculture sector. They have increased to 2005 by 14%. And in the next few decades to 2030, they will further increase by anything between 30 and 60%. What is actually required, and that is what you see below, is we need to reduce it to 2030 by 62%. So that is what we have as a major challenge. So we have growth rates in an order of magnitude which are required in terms of decrease. Okay? So we really don't need to take just a little screwdriver and turn the screw a little bit left and right now. You need to take the lever and turn it from left to right. And I'm afraid to say most decision makers, they just ignore that. And here is the key challenge for agriculture. This is the projection of the climate change-induced losses of agricultural production by 2018. And what is red, so dark red, is anything basically meaning 50% loss. This is absolutely catastrophic. If you take into consideration that in the two continents where you have the highest population growth, which is in Sub-Saharan Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa will double its population by till 2050, and South Asia, which will increase its population by roughly 40 to 45%, is confronted with average production losses in the order of 50%. So how do you make this work? Of course, that means we have the painting on the wall for a lot of political conflict at national level on soil and water, on migration, also at national level, but increasingly at international level. And as we have seen when the trouble started in Tunisia, so the Arab Spring, in fact, one of the key reasons was increases in food prices. So a lot of these conflicts, also national conflicts, portrayed as religious conflicts, turn out on scrutiny to be often related to access to land and water. And that is going to increase, not to decrease. So agriculture will increasingly be an issue for the international security agenda, not only as a sector. So having talked about all these calamities and very disturbing trends, now what is the much required paradigm shift in agriculture we see? So the authors see a change. The world needs a paradigm shift in agricultural development from a green revolution to an agro-ecological intensification approach, and I guess several of the previous speakers elaborated on that, so I can spare myself to basically go into very detail on that. This implies a rapid and significant shift from conventional monoculture-based and high external input-dependent industrial production towards mosaics of sustainable, regenerative production systems that also considerably improve the productivity of small-scale farmers. Sustainability, our authors define principally as the regenerative capacity of a system. So it should regenerate its own production methods, its own production conditions capacity. That is important. The required transformation is much more profound than simply tweaking the existing industrial agricultural system, so under the name of climate-friendly agriculture. Rather, what is called for is a better understanding of the multifunctionality of agriculture, its importance for rural livelihoods, resource scarcities, and climate change. We need to see a move from a linear to a much more holistic approach in agricultural management, which recognizes that the farmer is not only a producer of agricultural goods, but also a manager of an agro-ecological system that provides quite a number of public goods and services. And I want to say, I've heard somebody made a presentation on, we are not talking about subsidies here. We are talking about public goods and services rendered by these truly sustainable producers. And the public should recognize these services and these performances. So we are not talking about subsidies. These are payments for services, public goods and services render, and therefore they are justified and called for. And there is enough money if you just shrink the part doled out to conventional agriculture in subsidies which are completely misplaced. And finally, there's also a need for a trade regime that supports the transformation and allows us to make local regional products the first choice. So what we need is a combination, what I put in these four circles. We need a new definition of sustainable productivity. So productivity of a system, not only of individual products, in particular monoproducts. Second, we need to strengthen resilience to resources, to scarce resources, energy use, and to climate change. Thirdly, we need to address or include in this new approach the equity issue, so food security and farmer livelihoods. And there are many win-win-win opportunities in this regard. And finally, we need to reflect and capitalize on the multifunctionality of agriculture. So in conclusion, I would like to come to what are the key tasks we need to focus on. In fact, as we are, or in the situation we are in, we need realistically a dual strategy. On the one hand, a drastic reduction of the negative effects of conventional agriculture, and in parallel, a mainstreaming of agro-ecological production methods. We need to address the resource hotspots in particular, which are industrial livestock production and biofuels, because they are the principal resource, I would say, consumers, but also the sources of creating a lot of problems for agriculture in general. Let me just say one example, biofuels. In Germany, because of biofuel production, land prices in the last 5 years have more than doubled. In certain parts, they tripled. So that requires a productivity which can hardly be generated by even the most productive organic producers. So in other words, there has been a stagnation of organic farming. In fact, in some parts, there has been a reduction of agricultural surface under organic production. And some organic farmers have sort of converted themselves into energy farmers, which is, of course, exactly the wrong direction, what needs to be taken. We also need to deal with market asymmetries in the input and output markets, as I said, and that is probably one of the most important challenges, how to engage companies like Syngenta, the buyers of this world, in the agenda we are talking about, because frankly speaking, we are talking about a system which is to a large extent autonomous. So it is low external input dependent, and it is based on more small-scale producers than large-scale producers. So in other words, we are talking about a system in which these large companies have no clients. So how can you address that issue? How can you engage with them? I'm just putting this up for discussion because I'm facing this sort of problem when I'm invited to talks in Switzerland, and I'm often crossing there with some charming colleagues from Syngenta and the like. We have, in developing countries, the key task of rediscovering agriculture as an engine for economic and social development. As I said, 50 to 80% agriculture share in gross product, and at the same time we have agricultural share in government expenses of 5% or less. Let me say when you look globally at the landscape of the developing world, and you try to find truly successful cases of economic development. I mean, you know, most of the developing countries assumed their political independence in the 1960s. So this is now 50 years, roughly 50 years ago. So after half a century, and coming from a development organization like I'm from, one should honestly ask the question, look, what has come out after 50 years of development and a lot of support from the donor community and from public interest groups? And you come to a very sober-minded conclusions. There are not many successful cases. But some of them, when you look at them, they have placed an extraordinary importance on agriculture. And let me cite one prominently, which is Vietnam. Vietnam, and I know the country very well because I was in Vietnam, I have been in Vietnam quite often, and this country was completely destroyed at the end of the war, infrastructure-wise, mentally disturbed. They had reunification, I just want to say that, which is a major challenge. And then they had war again with China, they had Pol Pot in neighboring Cambodia, and yet they now have the most productive agricultural system in Asia. So how is that possible? And they were not a member of the World Bank, not a member of the World Trade Organization. They were even not able to draw on the funds of the Asian Development Bank in the region. So everything done on their own, and mostly based on agriculture. Because they said in agriculture generates the jobs we need for our quickly and mostly young population. Two, we want to overcome one critical challenge, and that is we want to overcome hunger. So self-sufficiency in food production was the prime political target. And thirdly, they said we will use agriculture as a source of accumulation. So we will industrialize the country based on agriculture. And that has been an outright success story. I have to say, of course, mostly that was based on conventional agriculture. But recently, for the last 10 years, there has been a shift. So the pendulum has swung from a scale focus to a more quality consciousness. So they are now looking at agro-ecological intensification from a completely different point of view. But I have to say, within 20 to 25 years, they have achieved food self-sufficiency and a level of economic development which is really impressive. So I just want to say that agriculture, therefore, even in this context, plays a key role. Much more attention to give to smallholders is another key task. Land reform and gender issues, that's very important. Land reform, there are hardly any success stories on land reform and on gender issues. And 70 to 80% of the farmers are female. So therefore, gender is a very important issue. Democratization of research and development. Where do the funds go? They go mostly into research underpinning conventional agriculture. And that is dead wrong. Reform of the international trade regime, so agriculture should not be treated like the steel or the car industry, because agriculture is mostly about local resources, about local markets, and about local constraints. And more importance should be accorded to stable food sovereignty. So don't, the past strategy to rely on international food markets has proven a dismal failure in the food price crisis 2008-2009. So that needs to be reconsidered. Another issue is discontinuing covert subsidies and incentives. I've already talked about that. And then developing consistent and a holistic strategy to support really sustainable production methods we don't seem to have a consistent strategy yet. That's my last slide. No, the second to last. What are the most important challenges in this regard? We need rather fundamental changes. Small steps will only yield small results. Remember, climate change is not around the corner. Climate change is with us. So don't talk about this 0.6 or 7%. We have to get far higher. Linear shifting of problems and the use of techno and quick fixes, that strategy prevails. There's a lack of systemic thinking to harness the multifunctionality of agriculture. There's a need for a proper definition of sustainable intensification and what is modern, truly modern agriculture. The production expansion focus prevails, as Musa Mubanga correctly said. Just one adds more with less environmental impact. As regards resources, nutrient and climate limits, the seriousness of the real threat and the real challenges are not yet appreciated. So in fact, I don't think we in particular at political level, they admit the seriousness of the challenge. Emphasis is placed on production-related changes without appreciating the importance of the thus required political and social transformation. The buzzword is changes in land tenure systems, gender, etc., cooperatives, democratization of research and development, the financial support, all of that. These are political and social transformation, not least changes in consumption patterns. That's also a very social issue. There's only lackluster progress on land reform and gender rights. Reform of the international trade rules is outstanding, and there needs to be stronger regulation of foreign investment in agriculture, the so-called land grabbing and speculative investment in soil and food systems. Let me close by saying more than 60 international experts have contributed their views to a comprehensive analysis of the challenges and the most suitable strategic approaches for dealing holistically with the interrelated problems of hunger and poverty, rural livelihoods, social and gender inequity, poor health and nutrition, and climate change and environmental sustainability. And that is one of the most interesting and challenging subjects of the present development discourse. To give you, in a nutshell, a visual illustration of the results of the required transformation, look at the examples of soil quality and fertility here at the bottom. Or on the left, you see an experiment. So these are 2 glasses of water. You have a bowl of organic soil and one of conventional soil, and the conventional soil disintegrates in the water after a few minutes. And that is the image taken after 10 minutes, where the bowl of organic soil was still physically intact. And you also see on the other side the different color. So you have organic soil, which is a living soil, and that makes all of the difference. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to being grilled